Hi, my name is Anthony DiBello. I'm the product manager for Guidance Software's compliance and cybersecurity solutions. Today I'll be talking about regulatory compliance in the digital age. In this presentation, you'll learn about the challenges of regulation using the red flag rules as a framework for our discussion today. I'm going to talk about how you can secure your PII, how to understand the evolving threat, mapping those threats to the relevant red flags, defining an incident response plan, and finally, recommendations and the key takeaways from this discussion. The most common challenges to regulatory compliance are endpoint visibility, the actual regulatory requirements themselves, the increased risk at the endpoints, and the lack of standard operating procedures in regards to modern regulations. And these issues are real. Some recent examples of data breaches include CheckFree Corp's January 6th breach, which involved 160,000 to 5 million credit card records that were exposed to a website hosted in the Ukraine. Heartland Payment Systems breach, which occurred on January 20th and involved 100 million transactions per month for several months that were routed by malicious software. The Federal Aviation Administration was breached on February 9th, and they were hacked for 48,000 records of employee information. And these are just a few examples to highlight the ongoing nature of network breaches. According to the Ponemon Institute's 4th annual U.S. Cost of a Data Breach study, average information leak costs organizations approximately $202 per record in 2008, and the average total per incident costs in 2008 were $6.65 million. Compared to an average per incident cost of $6.3 million in 2007. Looking at some of the actual costs of breaches that made news recently, Heartland Payment Systems, so far, their breaches cost $12.9 million, and they're still in the middle of a $6 million lawsuit with MasterCard. TJX experienced a $9.75 million cost for their breach, and that involved 50 million records. Some of the regulations driving compliance include California Senate Bill 1386, Massachusetts 201 CMR 17.00, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, the FTC's red flag rules, and the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. So what do all these regulations have in common? Well, they all seek to control the exposure of identifying information. And identifying information can be personal information like a name, social security number, date of birth, license, ID number, passport, biometric information like a person's fingerprint, their voice print, a retina scan, or other kind of physical information, and finally electronic information such as address, routing codes, or telecom ID numbers. Before getting into the red flag rules, I'd like to talk for just a moment about an individual state law, in this case an upcoming Massachusetts state law around data protection. This regulation requires all businesses that hold data on Massachusetts residents to comply. It's not restricted to businesses in Massachusetts, and requires destruction of certain records. Also requires the disclosure of breaches of databases containing personal information, and provides for enforcement by the Attorney General. Now, the enforcement is through fines, and those are no greater than $2,500 for a violation or series of violations concerning a specific consumer, and no greater than $100,000 in the aggregate for related violations concerning more than one consumer. In addition to these penalties, provided in subsection 3 of the regulation, the Attorney General may seek injunctive relief to prevent future violations from any given organization. So now let's look at the red flag rules. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission's Red Flags Rule requires businesses handling consumer financial accounts to combat identity theft by identifying those red flags that indicate theft and abuse in their organization. This law is pursuant to the Fair and Accurate Credit Transaction Act of 2003. It's been in effect since January 1st, 2008. However, enforcement's been delayed until later this year, 2009, as some organizations were unaware that they fell under the purview of these rules. So given that, who should comply? Well, all consumer-facing firms must comply. That is to say, all firms or organizations that defer payment for a good or service in one way or another. This is financial and other institutions such as banks, savings and loans, mutual savings banks, credit unions, retailers, mobile operators, hospitals, or any entity that directly or indirectly holds a transaction account belonging to a consumer. Well, what's a transaction account? Well, covered transaction accounts include checking and savings account, mutual funds, savings deposits subject to automatic transfers, share draft accounts, store credit cards, bank credit cards, mortgage and automobile loans, margin accounts, cell phones, and even utility accounts. What are red flags? Red flags refer to events or circumstances that indicate potential identity theft. These can apply to new accounts and existing accounts. Today, I'm only going to discuss red flags that are related to existing accounts, as that is where bulk identity theft takes place and where Accuvant and Guidance Software can help. Examples of a red flag in regards to existing accounts generally come as notices from other sources, such as law enforcement, internal IT security, or investigation or forensics teams within your own organization. FTC guidelines recommend 4 components. First, identify red flags, assemble your cross-channel teams, and create a written FTC compliance program. Second, detect red flags by monitoring the identified channels for abuse, detect authentication failures, breaches, and dissemination, and determine the extent of data spills in the event that one occurs. Third, prevent and mitigate identification theft with anti-malware tools, reduce sensitive data handling, implement authentication controls such as passwords, physical access controls, and biometric identification controls, and then implement and test the response process. Finally, update the program based on the learnings from the previous steps. Now, mapping security controls to the objective red flag requirements gives us the following matrix. For prevention, the objective is to prevent account information from being stolen. Tools for this objective include data leak prevention tools, data elimination tools, and disk encryption. For detection, the objective is to find unauthorized uses of account information. Tools for this objective include data discovery tools, data leak prevention tools, network monitoring tools, and forensic toolkits. For response, the objective is to notify affected parties. Tools for this objective include incidents handling response processes and tools, and breach notification processes. The first thing to do as you prepare to implement your red flags compliance program is to secure the personally identifiable information resident on your network. In securing personally identifiable information, you have to understand data location and what kinds of data is valuable to your organization. Is it just the personally identifiable information of your customers, or is it also intellectual property, source code, schematics that might belong to your organization? And do you know where all those crown jewels are? Processes and procedures should be in place to ensure that your crown jewels remain in authorized locations. In order to secure personally identifiable information across your network, you must first perform a targeted search of the live data. This is faster and more accurate than indexing, as it's happening in real time on the live data. It's useful if you have multiple search criteria options so that you can narrow down your focus tightly. Once the information is identified, collect and/or remove the information from the endpoints. In addition, at this point, you can migrate the data to a structured data repository for safekeeping if you so choose, at which point you can then remediate or eliminate the sensitive data that has been found to be in unauthorized locations on your network. In addition, this method can also help with records retention enforcement in terms of eliminating data that is outside the time frame that you're required to hold certain kinds of information. It's also recommended that you do periodic audits to ensure that the PII remains secure and is not reintroduced to your network. As part of this process, you can confirm that your data in motion DLP is working as intended, in that if you find any data that the DLP should be catching on your endpoint, you know you need to go back to that technology and fine-tune the policies that identify information as it's flowing from one place to another. Looking at the process flow for this operation, first you define your search criteria, then scan the network and review the results, but don't remediate yet. At this point, you'll want to tune your search criteria, possibly using hashes or an entropy value in order to narrow down your results. At this point, scan and remediate while collecting at the same time to ensure that you're not truly eliminating any of the data, just removing it from those unauthorized locations. At that point, rescan to verify the network or the business unit you're auditing is clean. Some additional possible steps include migrating the collected documents to an archive, maybe investigating the results if you find something suspicious, and finally improving the business processes that led to the leakage in the first place. And now let's hear from Jim Butterworth as he provides additional detail on securing sensitive information.
I'm Jim Butterworth, Senior Director of Cybersecurity with Guidance Software. The most important thing is the data that's on our network. All too often we take a traditional focus with regard to information security. What's important to us? Well, we know configuration of devices is very important to us. We take a lot of energy in making sure that our firewalls are configured correctly. We also take a lot of effort in our intrusion detection and our perimeter security. We also do things like buy stuff and appliances and make sure that we put those in place so that we can find data in motion. That's all fine. Finding data in motion is too late. We also apply access control lists to information that's sitting on our servers. We know that it's supposed to be there, and we know how to apply a discretionary access control to an account to lock down our crown jewels. Well, what I would argue is we need to actually shift the focus away from the devices and the actual physical things, and we need to start to shift the focus onto the actual data itself. Let me make this point. A 4 gigabyte thumb drive that you buy for $49 at your local electronics shop, if filled with text documents, if you were to print the entire contents of that 4 gigabyte thumb drive, you would end up with the equivalent stack of 16 Empire State Buildings. I would bet that that data is probably worth a lot more than $49. The point is, 4 gigabyte thumb drives are now commonplace. And the threat that these things pose to our networks, more specifically to the data, is really what we're after. So how do you secure it? Well, you need to find the information. And it's more than just finding it in normal formats. And that's where a lot of solutions end up just hitting the surface. They can only find things that maybe the operating system and the file table, the MF team, knows about. Well, we at Guidance Software say that in order to adequately find the information, you've got to be able to look at it in not just a structured format, but also unstructured formats as well. Finding data that's sitting in an Excel spreadsheet in ROT13 format, or somewhere in a database, you need to be able to find that information where it lives so that you can then apply data at rest encryption, an access control list. Get the information off of that asset to begin with. It shouldn't be there in the first place. So the key to securing the data is to locate the data where it is, make the determination whether the data should exist there, and then taking action on it.
In order to better tailor the red flags program to your individual organization, it's important to understand the evolving threats and how they relate to your business. By this point, we've all seen that perimeter defense is never really enough. And with new technologies come new exploits. Threats, in addition, can also be internal or even inadvertent. Now, on one end, a determined hacker will find a way. These individuals are being paid large sums of money to hack into your networks. They're researching their targets and designing malware to evade those particular defenses in place at that target. And on the low end, hacking has become productized. Any 13-year-old with a browser and knowledge of some IP addresses can launch denial of service attacks or any other kind of pre-canned attack that you can find in some of the web interfaces that are available today. Given all that, how do you identify the unknown threat? How do you limit the risk exposure presented by sensitive information resident on your network that does have a particular business reason for being there? How do you respond to a suspected threat? And finally, what can you do to limit the scope of a data breach? Now let's take a look at how these threats map to the relevant red flags. So to do that, you have to understand the potential threat vectors, which can come from any number of different places. One could just be intranetwork traffic, another email through phishing, open ports on the network, VPN access, insider threat, software vulnerabilities, even website vulnerabilities. Back to Jim Butterworth for more information on advanced threats to the network.
Today I'd like to talk to you about advanced persistent threats. More specifically, what are they, how do they work, and what are some of the tools that we've put together to help the defenders find these APTs and mitigate them. First thing you need to consider is that they're using designer malware. And when I use the term designer malware, what I'm really talking about is the enemy has done a level of reconnaissance against your network, and they've figured out not just how to get in, but how to stay in. The malware is really designed to be adaptable so that when they do detect that you're taking some sort of preventative measures, they will change things up on you, such as their beacon out points. It's also meant to be highly resilient so that when they start to detect things that you're doing, like when you do find the code and you decide to bring it into a sandbox in a virtualized environment, this malware can actually detect the presence of reverse engineering and shut itself down or encrypt itself. Some of the other things that they're able to do is live in places that you would not traditionally think that the code would live, such as the system volume, the sysvol. Also writing itself into the system restore. And when it does this, it changes some things up a bit. Now that's a little bit scary, because now you may have found the actual attack vector and you've gone through your steps to mitigate the threat. You've completely wiped it out, and then all of a sudden one of your users or even one of your sysadmins decides to roll the clock back, do a system restore following an application installation that maybe didn't go right. They roll back 2-3 weeks, and lo and behold, you've got this APT that's now revived on your network and phoning home again. That is what we mean by persistent threats. Persistent meaning that they're designed to survive. What makes the APT even scarier is that the attacker knows quite a bit about you, and what we've seen in some of these APTs, the attacker is actually able to follow your defensive techniques and completely reconfigure their environment to survive it, such as they can detect things on the firewall. They can detect the steps that you're taking on the inside that's going to actually put them into a switched environment, an enclave, if you will. They detect all that. They detect the presence of you changing your perimeter to blacklist or whitelist IPs and completely reconfigure their attack surface. One of the things that Guidance Software has developed is using entropy as an information data mining technique, where entropy is level of randomness within a file. We have brought enterprise-level entropy into the mix, where once we do find the file, we are able to find near matches. For instance, if a file were to be restored or written into the system restore, the hash is going to be different from the source file. However, if you use entropy, we're able to absolutely determine that it is a near match. Now, we're not going to tie them together as being absolutely attributed. We're going to give you the capability to find the file and have a look at it. That's really the key. Is once you do find these attacks, you've got to be able to follow them throughout the network as they're going through their persistent mechanisms to try to survive. We're bringing forth a tool that's going to allow you to do that.
Given all that, what's required to detect these red flags? First, what's required is complete visibility into the network endpoints. And you must audit unstructured data for PII and other red flags, including your file and email servers and the laptops and desktops that are scattered throughout the network. Log file auditing helps, and methods to identify unknown processes and files. And these methods involve focusing on the behavior, not the signature of an unknown file. Baseline your endpoints, that is to say, build a trusted example of what an endpoint should look like and audit against that trusted example. Use known binary hash databases. And for malware that evades detection by changing its signature, scan running processes for similarities. Looking at some different methods for determining file similarities and their associated weaknesses, we'll start with fuzzy hashing. This method is very easy to fool. If you make slight changes throughout a document, you'll throw out the entire fuzzy hash, rendering it useless. Second is signature-based detection. However, that requires exact matches, and while very useful for what it does, is entirely useless for finding malware that changes its signature. Finally, deep packet inspection. This is looking at every single packet that comes into your network, disassembling it, putting it back together, and looking at your findings. This just doesn't scale to the enterprise. To take apart and put back together every packet would take far too long to be effective. The approach that Guidance Software and Accuvant advocates is called entropy near match analysis. What is it? Well, entropy is randomness, and this technology expresses that randomness as a value between 1 and 8. 1 being very little randomness, and 8 being highly random. Like files, we've found through this patented pre-filtering that we've applied to this theory, have similar entropy value. Compressed and packed files have a very high, over 7 entropy. Binary files are very structured, thus have a similar entropy. And over the next few slides, I'll show you how this plays out. Here's an example of how entropy can be used to look for code mutation. Hash-based detection, looking at the top example here, doesn't help. You see all the hash values are completely different. But using NK cybersecurity, you can see the most similar binaries for a computer or network through its entropy calculation, represented as a value on the right side of the lower image. Once a similarity scan is complete, you can easily view which of the scanned machines have the largest concentration of binaries similar to the original malware binary. Drilling into a specific machine, you can then view all the near matches ranked by most similar to least similar. Here's 10 recommended red flags that you can implement in your enterprise. First, look for account information on unauthorized workstations. Account information on a web or email server. Unencrypted account information. Unscheduled bulk data transfers after hours. File sharing software such as BitTorrent. Unknown processes running on a workstation. Account privilege escalation or out-of-band activity. Encrypted compressed file repositories on any given endpoint. A large number of removable drives on a single computer. Unpatched applications. Finally, the red flag rules require an incident response program. When a breach occurs, work with the legal department to understand local data breach notification laws. Determine the exact scope of the breach to limit your potential costs. Secure any personally identifiable information within the scope of the breach. Locate the source of the breach using investigation toolkits. Remediate malicious processes or any exposed sensitive information. Periodically scan against the findings to ensure the threat is not reintroduced to the network. And finally, preserve all findings and evidence to prove due diligence. We recommend you assess your risk. The risk through the transaction accounts such as the financial, telecom, and medical account records, and customer information used for financial gain, such as PII, account details, and government identifiers. Second, assess your readiness. Assess your prevention readiness, your detection readiness, and your response readiness. Third, implement the red flags and data compliance program particular to your organization and take into account people, such as the plan owner, IT security, and all channels and functions. The process, in the form of a written plan, detection of abuse, authentication failures, and the technologies, data loss prevention technologies, data discovery technologies, proactive malware detection, forensic tools, intrusion detection systems, and encryption technologies. If you do nothing else as a result of watching this today, ensure the personally identifiable information resides only in authorized areas of the network that have a legitimate business reason for being there. Implement proactive security measures to minimize the risk of a breach and determine the exact scope of any suspected breach in order to minimize your reaction costs. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me today. I'm Anthony DiBello with Guidance Software, and I ask that you please contact your local Accuvant account manager for more information on how Accuvant and Guidance Software can help address these issues, or call Accuvant Direct at 541-245-3637.